Siegfried thought he got away with it. What he'd done to Denise was inexcusable, but he didn't think she could do anything about it. He didn't reckon on her strength of feeling or the depth of her special knowledge. For her part, Denise Wilkins didn't reckon Mockingbirds ate bees when she first met Siegfried Johnson, which is what led to the whole affair in the first place. "I heard you keep honeybees," she said. His lustrous brown eyebrows flexed skyward like a pair of moustaches on strings. "Yes." She liked him straight away. His cheeks were all round and cute like tomatoes when he smiled. His hazel eyes glistened. He looked around, making a show of checking for eavesdroppers. They were at a sun-drenched village fete with craft stalls and trestle tables selling jam and chutney. None of the well-dressed affluent fete-goers were in earshot. He turned back to Denise and said in a low voice, "Maybe you could show me your hive sometime." She smiled despite herself and decided to play along. "We've only just met, I don't even know your name." It wasn't quite as simple, but it wasn't far off. "Siegfried Johnson, your hand, ma'am." He was playing a part, that was obvious, but she found herself drawn in all the same. She extended her hand and they shook, which was just right, because it would have been too cheesy if he'd kissed it. "Denise Wilkins, AES." He frowned in mildly amused puzzlement. "Oh, it's the Amateur Entomology Society, sorry. Sometimes I forget not everyone knows about it." She explained her actual job was a PA in an accountancy firm, but the AES was where her heart really lay, apiary in particular. "I've always wanted to keep bees, Denise, but I never seem to get round to it," he told her. "Do you use a Langstroth hive?" She was impressed. "No, Worry, it's more natural." "I've heard that, yes." Within 5 minutes he had invited himself round to have a look at her vertical top bar. Fast work. And she checked up on him in the days leading up to his visit. She would cancel if she learned anything unsavoury. Her friends, Joan, the village GP, and Francis, owner of a reclaimed furniture business, had lived in Kipler's Grange all their lives and knew virtually everyone. Over a pint of Kipler Mild at the Golden Eagle, they told her the history of Siegfried Johnson. He had moved to the village 2 years after a divorce, worked for the council as an environmental officer, lived alone, was involved in the Amateur Dramatic Society, otherwise known as KGADS. He'd had a few dalliances with local girls, but nothing had got off the ground. Overall, a non-psychotic male with a tendency to overdo the charming gentleman act. They encouraged her to keep the appointment. "Well, send us safety texts every half hour," Francis had urged. Denise had done so for the first couple of hours, but stopped after that. He seemed a genuinely nice man. Devilish flirty, but nothing untoward. She felt at ease in his company, despite this being only their second meeting. He asked her about beekeeping and appeared interested in her replies. And when she asked him questions, he answered with openness and apparent sincerity. He told her about his own hobby of breeding mockingbirds, for sale to pet shops and other mockingbird enthusiasts. "They really are a fascinating bird. They imitate the calls of other birds, but also any other sound they hear. I've had birds doing the Nokia ringtone." "Really? Did you try to answer it?" They both laughed. He smiled at her with his sparkly chocolate eyes, and she smiled back, and then looked away, leaving what she hoped was a bashful sweetness hanging in the air. Her heart actually fluttered. It had been a couple of years since it had done that. Not since the mediocre 6 months with John that had bumped along the bottom like a stricken submarine. In the garden behind the whitewashed cottage her parents had left her, he nodded to a white wooden box. "So, this is the war, eh? Just the one?" She nodded. "Made it myself from number 2 pine. Nice and light. I'm only an amateur. It produces enough honey to sell to friends and neighbours, or not enough for a stalker to fate." She watched him admiring the hive as the bees bumbled to and fro. Horizontal beams of sunlight streamed through the trees, backlighting him, turning the motes and midges into rushing constellations. The soporific bee drone, the tranquil warmth of the evening, Siegfried's halo that looked tailor-made by a skillful director of photography. It made her happy. After 3 hours, it was time for him to go. "Can I come again tomorrow? You can tell me more about natural beekeeping. Maybe let me taste your honey." Any other man had no place saying something like that, but with him it was okay. She said yes, and he pecked her on the cheek, smiled, and left. She was disappointed he hadn't gone for the full snog. Well, maybe his divorce had made him cautious. But there was always tomorrow. Tomorrow she intended to get some sugar. She was quickly coming to the conclusion this one was a keeper. In the morning, she went out to check the bees. The hive was gone. A square of bare earth marking its absence. She didn't want to suspect Siegfried, but it was hard to avoid. She stood in her back garden as insects swirled and birds twittered in the morning sun and sobbed, her face in her hands. It was stunning how fast good things could turn bad. Just like that, her soft hopes of romance were crushed and she had a new problem. She went into the cottage and composed herself. She remembered Siegfried's mockingbirds and Googled them. It turned out bees were a favoured part of their diet. She hoped there was time to save them. Siegfried's place was a detached new build off the main road. She knocked on the PVC door with its little bull's-eye window pane and heard footsteps inside. Apprehension swooped in her belly. Siegfried opened the door. From somewhere inside, birds screeched. He looked as though he'd been expecting her. "Hello," he said. He sounded bored. "Did you take my hive?" "No." "I'm pretty sure you did." "Prove it." She glared at him, any nervousness eclipsed by indignance. "Have you fed them to the birds yet?" "I don't have them." She listened for the drone of her hive, but couldn't distinguish between that and the ambient buzz of wild June insects. She took a step forward, trying to look into the gloomy hall, but he blocked her view. "Give me them." "I don't have them." "You do." "I think it's best if you leave now." He started to close the door. "I'm sorry you lost your bees, but it's nothing to do with me." The door shut with a cheap plastic slam. She stared at the whiteness, her face rumpled in the reflection of the bull's-eye, fighting off tears of exasperation. He was so brazen it took her breath away. But even then, despite her shock, and before she'd even tried of the police, she half knew what she was going to do to him. At the station, PC Darwood, overweight, hook-nosed, semi-competent, took the particulars and went to Siegfried's, who showed him round. He had covered his tracks well. Darwood found nothing except a score of grey mockingbirds in the aviary at the back, some of them squawking, some of them chirping, some of them doing the HTC as opposed to the Nokia ringtone. Without proof, the constable could do nothing. Instead, he stumbled around Denise's back garden and failed to find any clues. He asked around the village. No one had seen a dicky bird. The village lacked CCTV. There was no way to find out who had taken the hive. He said he would keep an eagle eye out and suggested she put up some posters, but regretted to inform her that the matter couldn't be taken any further. Joan and Francis implored Denise to do something, but none of them knew what, and following a period of outraged injustice, helplessness set in. The matter gradually faded into the background, becoming an irritant, then a niggle. Eventually, it disappeared almost entirely, like the bare patch of lawn under the stolen hide that had grown fresh, green grass. Siegfried continued to mosey around the village, partaking in the odd tryst with some unsuspecting female prey. He was seen laughing with friends in the old barleycorn, discussing pedestrian matters in a flamboyant manner. For instance, "My washing blew off the line this morning, must have been a hurricane." And, "Been working on Gerard. If K-Gads don't give me Romeo this year, I'll eat my hat." Another marginalia from his life. K-Gads was the first place to report something odd about Siegfried. Gerard Fuse, K-Gad's chairman, had given in to Siegfried's insistent badgering and given him the male lead in Romeo and Juliet. During rehearsals one August evening, he had run off stage in the middle of killing Paris. He had gone home wearing a big raincoat that belonged to Bill Leonard, who was always moaning about it being cold. Bill's property was promptly returned, dry cleaned. Less was seen of the bee thief after that. He stopped joshing with his chums in the boozer, abandoned his Andran, even had time off work according to people from the Environmental Office. It was over Kipler Mild that Denise found out vengeance was hers. "I take patient confidentiality very seriously," Joan said. Denise, Francis and her were in the snug. The village's GP wore a stern expression which didn't convince Denise one bit. She just nodded and waited for it. "So this does not go any further." Francis leaned forward, eyes big and bright. She glanced at Denise, who was taking a sip of ale and watching Joan. "Our friend went into Trentide surgery today. Seems he didn't want to come and see his local GP. Alan called me." "Well, what did he say?" Francis asked. Joan lowered her voice. Denise came forward, joining Francis. "He had about a dozen lesions all over his back. Boils." Francis sat back and curled a disgusted lip. Denise did a barely perceptible shrug and had another gulp of beer. It was going down well. Myiasis. Alan examined them. They were full of pus. Some had already burst. Oh, that would have been messy. Francis had been holding her pint pot. Now she put it down with a clunk, appetite ruined. "He lanced one. Aside from the pus, a few maggots squirmed out." Francis' expression now slipped into a kind of appalled irritation, mouth agape. Both her and Joan looked to Denise. "Well, what could do that?" Joan asked her. Denise said, "Cordylobia anthropophagia, the putsy fly, found in East and Central Africa. Lays its eggs on clothes left on the ground to dry. They hatch when they're worn, set off by body heat. The larvae burrow into the flesh and make these boils." "But Denise, it's illegal to import dangerous insects like that," cautioned Joan, "and a health hazard. Unless you have a licence and take the proper precautions." She gave Joan a look. It said, "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." "His best M&S shirt might have blown off his washing line," she continued. "Maybe a pussy fly in its holidays laid some eggs." Denise did a cockeyed smile and drained off the last third of her pint. She put it down with a resolute thud on the Kipler's mild beer mat. "Don't mess with a member of the Amateur Entomologist Society."